Yeah, Jason Wygant here, RacerX Podcast Network. Something new that we've been trying over on the magazine side with RacerX Illustrated, the read-alouds. The narrators of the feature stories inside the magazine also provide audio versions that you can listen to. Go to racerxonline.com/audio. You do have to be a subscriber normally to listen to these, but we're going to unroll 3 recent features from the magazine on our podcast network so you can get an idea of the kind of work that we are doing. It's racerxonline.com/audio to access these. But you do have to subscribe, so go to racerxonline.com/subscribe. It's super cheap. How cheap? How about less than $1? 99 cents will get you 3 months access to the digital edition. You can also listen to the audio with that, or spend $2.99 for 3 months of both the print and digital edition. The digital allows you to read it right through our website or on your phone or your laptop or your tablet, your desktop, if anyone has those. And a print, I think you know exactly what that is. That's in your mailbox. That's a printed magazine. But maybe you find audio more convenient. The stories inside RacerX Illustrated are completely exclusive. You cannot access them through our website without a subscription, but it is fun to hear them if it's more convenient for you to do that. So we're going to continue to roll out a few of these. You might have listened to what we already posted, which was Day 1 at Daytona. That was Davey Coombs reading and writing about the very first Daytona Supercross. Now, from our June issue, it's Davey Coombs reading his story called Lockdown, which is the week after this year's Daytona Bike Week when the entire sport shut down, from Daytona through the Indianapolis Supercross, when the world, the country, and the sport had to simply stop existing as we know it.
This is RacerX Read Aloud. We're reading from the June 2020 issue, and this is a feature I wrote called Lockdown. Literally days after Daytona, the entire world began shutting down amid the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, stopping almost every motorsport series in its track. For how long remains to be seen. On Wednesday morning, March 11th, Jason Wygant was plotting his next move. He and his family were still at Daytona International Speedway as the RCSX amateur race had finished up the day before. They'd be driving home to Charlotte the next day, and Jason had a busy weekend ahead. He would fly to Indianapolis for a RacerX Pulp MX live show the night before the Indy round of Monster Energy AMA Supercross, then fly back to Daytona early the next morning to announce Saturday's Daytona TT as well as Sunday's Daytona 200 for NBC Sports Network. All systems were go, or so he thought. Around the world, sporting events were being postponed or canceled. The COVID-19 coronavirus was taking hold in places like China and Italy. The Arab nation of Qatar announced that it would no longer allow flights from Italy to land there, which caused the cancellation of the MotoGP opener, which was also supposed to air on NBC Sports in America, with Wygant as studio host. Around the same time, Formula One announced the cancellation of its first 4 races in Australia, China, Bahrain, and Vietnam. Meanwhile, in France, MXGP journalist Jeff Meyer was wandering the normally crowded streets of Paris. Meyer was on his way to the MXGP of Argentina, making a connecting flight at Charles de Gaulle Airport, when he got a text telling him not to get on the plane. The race was postponed. Admittedly skeptical at first of the seriousness of the situation, Meyer decided to try to make the best of it with a couple of vacation days in the City of Lights. But why were all the streets and museums empty? Slowly, news of domestic events began to change and then change again. The NCAA basketball tournaments would take place without fans. The Golden State Warriors announced that their next NBA home game would play without fans. Then the entire NBA followed suit. Still, not everyone took it seriously. One basketball player, Rudy Gobert, jokingly touched the microphones and tape recorders of every reporter at a press conference. A couple days later, he would be diagnosed with COVID-19. And when another Utah Jazz player tested positive just before the tip-off of a game with the Houston Rockets, league officials shut the entire NBA down. The NCAA followed suit with the sudden cancellation of March Madness. Back in Daytona, Wygant and American flat track boss Michael Locke were glued to NASCAR news, knowing they might have to follow the lead of other racing series. During lunch, NASCAR put out a press release about its upcoming race in Atlanta. And for a moment, the Flat Track media room held its collective breath. NASCAR announced its races would continue, only with more hand sanitizer at the venue and restricted driver autograph sessions. Locke did think perhaps rounds 2 or 3 could be in danger of having to run without fans. What a way to start a season. The next morning in Europe, the dominoes continued to fall. Upcoming rounds in all series were being pushed back. The 20-round MXGP series, which had completed its first 2 races in early March in Matterley Basin in the UK and Valkenswaard, Holland, postponed races in Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, and Indonesia. Quote, "Why does it feel like Valkenswaard was months ago when in fact it was just a week ago?" Jeff Meyer wrote while still in Paris. Quote, "It's been the weirdest week of my life, not comparable to losing a parent or divorce in the sense of sadness, but without question, very weird and unstable." Unquote. He wasn't alone in his feelings of uncertainty and displacement. The strange virus was spreading everywhere, and soon restaurants, movie theaters, and shopping malls worldwide were being told to close. It also started to affect Monster Energy Supercross, first in Seattle, which had suddenly become a hot zone for the virus. Seattle was on the schedule for March 28th, but then Governor Jay Inslee placed restrictions on public gatherings, resulting in the first postponed Supercross since 1992, when riots in Los Angeles after the beating of motorist Rodney King caused a 3-week delay. Detroit would soon follow. But what about Indianapolis? Jason Wygant told me later, quote, "By Thursday, I had decisions to make. I needed to drive home to North Carolina, drop my family off, then head to the airport Friday morning to fly to Indianapolis. My fear was getting to Indy, then watching airports close and flights get grounded, leaving me unable to get back to Daytona." Unquote. And said Sean Brennan, the Feld Entertainment public relations manager for motorsports, quote, "I was at a local TV station with Indiana rider Ezra Hastings at 7:20 in the morning. 10 a.m., we were at a second station doing the same thing, but behind the scenes we knew things were fluid. We had a conference call on our end with local government, the stadium, and we were all talking A, B, and C scenarios." Unquote. Well, the Lucas Oil Stadium track was already built and ready to go for the 11th round of a close series. Indiana Governor Eric Holcomb issued an order stating that citizens were limited to gatherings of 250 people. In Supercross, if you counted each rider and mechanic, the flagman, officials, and safety crew, and maybe the television people, you'd already be right around that number. Quote, "Each hour during my drive, I asked my wife to check the text on my phone," Wygant said. Quote, "If something changed with the Indy SX, surely I would find out. And sure enough at noon, Steve Mathis texted that the race would take place without fans." Unquote. Unfortunately, the governor's order didn't stop at just 250 people. The Feld PR man Brennan explained, quote, "The language said 250 people within a confined space, but then they defined that as a stadium. That was the kicker. We knew we were done. You really had to look into the language." Unquote. News that the race would be forced to cancel spread quickly. Said Wygant, quote, "I got a call from Cade Clayson. He was in the airport security line heading to Indy and wanted to know if he should proceed. I told him the race was canceled. Then I got a text from privateer Travis Delnicki. He was halfway to Indy in his van. I told him to turn around." Unquote. Offered Team Honda's Ken Roczen, quote, "Everything was normal, like the race was happening. Then before you know it, I was talking to Justin Brayton, and he's like, 'Have you heard that the race might be canceled?' And I'm like, 'What?' We were literally about to leave to go to the airport 20 minutes later. So we actually postponed our flight that night to see if there were any more news or anything going out." End quote. They would soon find out that they wouldn't be flying anywhere. Roczen says, "We were like, holy cow, I know that Chase Sexton and those guys, they were already in the plane to go there," unquote. Added Roczen, who had already told fans that he would no longer be signing autographs due to the virus, quote, "From then on, it was like within the next 24 hours, it was worse, and then the next 24 hours, it was even worse," unquote. The worse that Roczen was referring to was the fact that cases of COVID-19 were multiplying globally by the hundreds of thousands. People were beginning to die from it, first by the hundreds, soon by the thousands. It had become a global pandemic. Needless to say, the entire sports world started shutting down, and iconic events dropped from the calendar en masse. The Boston Marathon, the Masters Golf Tournament, the Monaco Grand Prix, even the Hangtown Motocross Classic, as nearby San Francisco, like Seattle, had also become a hotspot. Meanwhile, back down south, the Wygant family truckster was still headed north from Georgia, though the driver wasn't sure why or where he should be going next. Wygant explained, quote, "I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled off the Interstate 95 exit for Savannah, Georgia, and just stopped. I was halfway between home and Daytona, and all I could do was wait. Thursday was spent holding my phone in one hand, fielding calls while also playing soccer in a Savannah park with my kids. By about 5 o'clock, the cancellation of the Indianapolis SX seemed imminent. That sunk our whole live show too. And by 6:30, the race was officially canceled, so we decided to just go home," unquote. Meanwhile, some outdoor events were still going on. The AMA Grand National Cross Country Series was set to run its third round, the General, in Washington, Georgia. At Dade City in Central Florida, Red Bull's A Day in the Dirt Down South had already begun. Each event had made sure that there were no restrictions passed in the wake of the spreading virus. The General would run to its conclusion over the weekend, with FMF KTM factory rider Caleb Russell edging out Factory One Sherco Stu Baylor with a thrilling last-minute pass for the overall win. A Day in the Dirt Down South would not be so lucky. On Friday evening, around 10 p.m., police vehicles rolled in. Messaged DMX Radio's Kevin Kelly, who was set to announce the event, quote, "The sheriff just showed up and they're shutting us down," unquote. The police explained that everyone needed to be gone from the facility by 7 the next morning due to the growing health crisis, and sure enough, they were back the next morning to follow up. As for our man Wygant, his on-again, off-again travel plans continued to change. Quote, "The next day, I planned to head right back to Daytona again, but something told me I should wait as long as possible in case plans changed," he said. "I scoured NASCAR Twitter feeds, Twitter still being the best place for NASCAR news, to see how the Atlanta NASCAR race was holding up. The race had changed from extra hand sanitizer to running without fans until, suddenly, NASCAR canceled outright. I called everyone I knew in flat track to gauge the impact, but amazingly, they decided the races would still run. So I hopped in my Jeep and headed back to Florida," unquote. Ever the multitasker, Wygant got on a call with Mathis and Jason Thomas so they could record a podcast about the whole unfolding situation. 2 hours into Ouija's drive and an hour into the podcast, American Flat Track canceled the Daytona TT and the Daytona 200. Said Wygant, "I took an exit in South Carolina, turned back north, and headed home," unquote. But there was one more race happening that he could drive to. That General GNCC was concluding on Sunday in Georgia. Quote, "I found the last beacon of hope for a reporter trying to find a race to cover. Somehow, we'd have to fill the RacerX online website without a Supercross taking place. The General was still happening, so on Sunday morning, I headed down to check out the race. Somehow, the race went on, unlike every other thing scheduled for that weekend." End quote. After the race, Wygant returned home to his family in Charlotte, where he's been ever since, watching along with the rest of the world as the planet shut down. Schools and borders were closed, businesses were shuttered, factory production was halted, and hospitals filled up as the treacherous virus continued to spread. By the end of the next week, a record 3.3 million U.S. citizens filed for unemployment, and we passed a frightening milestone. 1,000 Americans had already died after contracting COVID-19 as this magazine was going to print. I hate to end this story here, but this is where we are. There are no races running. The last to be canceled was the James Stewart Spring Championship at Freestone in Texas after about a dozen practice sessions, and there is no relief in sight. The start of the MXGP was pushed back to June 7th in Russia. Lucas Oil Pro Motocross backed up to June 13th in Florida. As for Monster Energy AMA Supercross, it likely won't start up again until sometime in September. We call this story Lockdown because that's what the whole world is on right now. How long it lasts and how bad it gets is anyone's guess. But one thing is certain, we really are all in this together. The end.
And that's our lockdown feature as read and written by Davey Coombs. And what's interesting about that one, even though that really chronicled the event starting really with that Wednesday, March 11th, which is, I believe, going to be eventually remembered as the day that this quarantine really took root in the United States. And then this story goes from then till about a week later. We really haven't seen a massive change in the racing front since then. Everything remains shut down. And we do wait more news, but nothing is locked in. We only know that there's a lockdown, and we'll get to that news when we can. And when it does happen, it's a great way to read more about it is through the pages of RacerX Illustrated, the magazine. If you want to listen to more of these RacerX Read Alouds, you need a subscription to do that. So go to racerxonline.com/subscribe. 99 cents for 3 months of digital access, which also allows you to listen to the Read Alouds. $2.99 for 3 issues of both digital and print. Go to racerxonline.com/readalouds if you're a subscriber, and then you'll be able to listen to them all. Hint, hint, we are releasing 3 of these in podcast form that anyone can listen to for free, so you know what we're talking about. That was day 1 at Daytona. That was this lockdown, and also we'll have one other episode coming. Rob Andrews reading his feature story, The Cathedral of Motocross. So stay tuned for that on the RacerX Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.